Hello class, welcome to chapter 3. So in this chapter we're going to be covering perception and looking at perception, how it relates to interpersonal communication, and taking a broader look at how it influences and informs how we interact and engage with one another. So let's go ahead and begin. So first thing I want to talk about is how we perceive each other. And I think it's important to first highlight that we communicate based off of how we perceive one another. So depending on how we see one another, it determines how we interact and how we engage one another. Perception is the process of making meaning from environmental experiences. So what you see in your environment, interacting with other people, that helps form our perception. Interpersonal perception helps us make meaning from our behaviors, and not only our own behaviors, but the behaviors of other people as well. So now, since we got the definition of perception and interpersonal perception out of the way, one thing that I believe is important to understand is that we perceive something, and then what we do is we organize it. So, for example, if you, let's say, dated a person under 5'2", and every person you dated under 5'2" was just a mean person, right? After a while, you may not want to date people under 5'2" anymore because it's giving you so many bad results. Another example would be if you dated an Aquarius. Every Aquarius you met, you got along with really well. It was an absolutely great relationship. So you base your experience on how you view other people based on their sign, whether they're Aquarius, if they're Cancer, if they're Gemini. There's a lot of people who actually do that. And that has everything to do with perception. So we're not going to look at perception, but we're also going to look at how we classify people. I want you to take a moment real quick and look at this picture. And I'm going to ask you some rhetorical questions. So judging by this picture right here, what is this gentleman? What do you think his level of education is? What type of education do you think he has? Where do you think he works at? Do you think he's middle class? Do you think he's poor? Do you think he's upper middle class? What about this gentleman to the right? What do you think he is? What type of education do you think he has? What kind of religion does he belong to? Do you believe he's pro-life or pro-choice? Do you believe he's for marriage equality, or do you think he's for traditional marriage? Now, there's no right or wrong way to answer the questions, but typically students answer these questions very consistently across the board, right? They look at the gentleman to the right, they say he's a doctor, he's upper middle class, he's highly educated, he went to medical school, he works in a hospital or at his own clinic, right? And then judging to the man on the right, they say, well, he's a minister, he's Christian, he's pro-life, he's for traditional marriage. Um, and I say that to get to a more poignant point. Is the fact that we don't know either of these people, right? But based off of how they look, we automatically put them in classifications, and we judge how much education they have, what are their values, whether they're gainfully employed or not. So this has a lot to do with how we view other people. Is we classify them. We look at a certain thing, and based off of that, we give meaning to it, and we put them in a category. It doesn't mean that we're bad people. It's just something that we do, and it's important to be aware of it. So what you just engaged in was called the selection process. The process of selecting a stimuli or an impression that we pay attention to. And this can go in a lot of directions. It doesn't have to be just a person dressed up as a doctor or wearing a religious outfit. This could be somebody who we think is attractive, right? We might think that they are smarter or more intelligent or more engaging because they are attractive to us. Um, and so we found something that, a stimuli that caught our attention. Wow, he's prettier. Wow, she's cute. Um, and we pay attention to that. Stimuli is something that we sense that attracts our attention. And then what we do with the stimuli is we organize it and we place it into different categories, and then we give meaning to that message. And what we do is we interpret that. We give assign meaning to the message based on how a person looks, the clothes they wear, the location that they go to, their ethnicity, their race, their gender. All these things have meaning, right? And we associate meaning and we categorize people based off of the stimuli that we see. And like I said, it doesn't make a person bad because they do it, but it's important to recognize that we do it, and it influences our perception of one another. So perception principles is how we process and organize and select sensory stimuli. So you look at the picture over to the left. I thought this was kind of an interesting picture when I was putting together the PowerPoint. Is over to the right you have the police officers that says, hey, Black Lives Matter. And over to the left you have an African American gentleman that sits there and says, hey, Blue Lives Matter. But if you're watching the news, you can see that it's almost like you have to pick sides, right? You have one side that might have a negative view towards law enforcement, and then you have people who are pro law enforcement that may not understand discrimination and biased police practices. One of the best things I heard was on a morning show called Meet the Press, and one of the gentlemen he made a profound statement. He said that in regards to the recent protests in the Black Lives Matter movement, he said, one thing that would really help is empathy across both sides. Empathy to realize that we need police officers, that most police officers are good and they do an excellent job protecting the community, and that policing is very important to having a safe civil society. And then he said, on the other end, we need empathy to realize that sometimes people of color experience the justice systems in ways that people in the majority would not tolerate. So we have to see both sides and come to an agreement on both perspectives. And I think that's so important, is to not limit your own perception of something from your own cultural framework, right? But to begin to look at your perception from other frameworks. So let's look back here at the PowerPoint. We have what's called selective exposure, which means exposing ourselves to messages that support our pre-established belief system. The way I kind of see this is if you are a diehard conservative and you listen to Fox News and Rush Limbaugh, for example, or let's say you are a diehard liberal and you listen to MSNBC and what's the gentleman's name? I forgot his last name ends with Stewart, but he's a pretty popular person. Or Bill Maher, for example, that's pretty liberal. Uh, and so a lot of times I'll have people who are very liberal or they're very conservative, and they'll watch their news outlets and they'll sit there and say, I like Fox News because they tell it like it is. And it's just like, well, you're kind of conservative, so maybe it's selective exposure where you're actually paying attention to the thing that supports your belief system. Or you'll have somebody who's very liberal and they'll be like, I watch MSNBC and I listen to um, Bill Maher because, gosh, he tells it like it is. And it's like, well, no, I think it's more you're engaging in selective exposure than the fact that they're objective, right? And then we have selective attention, paying attention to messages we already believe, right? So if you are a person who is a Christian and you believe in the Bible, then you're more than likely going to be paying attention to those types of messages. You're not going to be paying attention to people who might be of the Buddhist faith. You might not be inclined to listen to messages of people who are of Muslim background and faith. Typically people pay attention to messages that they already believe, and they on a subconscious level filter out things that maybe they don't believe. And this is something that is, like I said, doesn't make you a bad person, but it's something that we have to be aware that we do. And so every once in a while we have to realize that about ourselves, and myself included. There's selective interpretation, and there's selective recall. And then last is perception checking. So go ahead and make sure you read those in your books, because you're going to want to know that, because you're going to see those types of perception principles included on an exam. And we have punctuation, which is determining the causes of effects in a series of interactions. So if you look at how people perceive each other. So let's say in a relationship, you have a husband and you have a wife, and the husband sits there and says, uh, "You're always nagging me about where I put my clothes." Right? That's where he's punctuated and focused on that thing. Then his wife says, "Well, I nag because you don't put your clothes where you're supposed to." Right? That's her punctuation and her perception on the course of events. And then the guy will come back and say, "Well, if you didn't nag me, maybe I put my clothes where I'm supposed to." And then she comes back and says, "Well, if you put your clothes where you're supposed to, I wouldn't have to nag." So you can see how like that's kind of cyclical. And it just depends on what part of the perception they punctuate and pay attention to. Where are their points where they focus on. Lastly is negotiation, which is influencing our perceptions in order to achieve a shared perception. So the book talks about that in page 83. I want you guys to read about that and get a deeper understanding of it, because that's going to be really important to solving these types of perception problems that are involved with punctuation. So stereotyping. Stereotyping is an exaggerated generalization associated with a categorization system. So basically, whenever we categorize people, right, we put them in a box, right? Men are like this, women are like this, Hispanics are like this, blacks are like this, um, Marines are like this, right? So by putting in people in a categorized system, we generalize, and there might be some truth, but we really have to be mindful of stereotyping, because a lot of times it can skew the way we view people. There's an assignment on this page in which, or in this module, which you're going to be looking at stereotypes and how that affects how we view gender, sex, race, privilege, right? And these are all stereotypes that we have. But how does it work when we don't check our own stereotypes? And what are the consequences for not doing that? So in this activity, I want you to kind of keep an open mind, understand what stereotyping means, and be able to uncover those types of things in your discussion posts. And I think you're going to get a lot out of it. So what influences our perception of one another? Well, there's some internal influences, and uh, there's some external influences as well. So access to information, how much do you know about the world around you, right? So you might have a perception of Korean people as one way. But if you don't really learn about Korean people, if you've never been to Korea, if you've never studied the culture, that might influence your perception. Think about how the talk in our country about immigration, right? And so if you have family and you interact and you know people who are from Mexico, who are from south of the border, then your perception might be different than a person who's never developed those relationships. So we always have to ask ourselves, what access of information do we have? And how is my abundance of information or my lack of information influencing how I perceive this group of people or this situation? Other influences of our perceptions include our senses, what we can see, what we can hear, what we can smell, right? Psychological challenges, maybe ADHD, bipolar, depression, other issues like that. Our age influences our perception, right? If you're older, maybe you sit there and say, "Well, I've been there, done that, bought the T-shirt, I've seen it all." And if you're younger, you might think the same thing too. It just depends. Also, health and fatigue influences your perception. Hunger, I know when I'm hungry, like the Snickers commercial, right? You're not you when you're hungry. I know that when I'm hungry, I have trouble with my perception of things. Even alcohol, there's a picture that I put here. It's kind of a funny one, but before 6 beers, this is what you see, right? and then after 6 beers changes your perception. So alcohol is a very powerful tool in changing our perceptions. Some of us make some pretty questionable choices if we drink too much alcohol, right? And then also biological cycles influences how we see other people. So let's look at some influences of our perception. We have what's called ethnocentrism. That's a big word. But ethnocentrism, boil it down, it means the belief that our own culture is superior and most significant. So you hear people sit there and say, well, in America, we speak American and we do this and we do that, and not recognize the uniqueness of other people's culture. Interestingly enough, I was probably ethnocentric for a large part up until the point I left the country completely. When I started traveling internationally, that's when I got to see different cultures and realized, oh my gosh, I'm kind of helpless here and I'm dependent on other people who have their own culture, their own way of the world, and they need to help me. And I need to be more patient because I never knew that might have been impatient with people who might be assimilating or coming into our culture and experiencing things through our perspective. So that's going to be really important. A few other things that we need to look at is sex, gender roles. These are also things that influences our perception. So before I dive, I don't want to dive too deep in this section because I believe that the discussion that you're going to be going into for this module is really going to tackle those issues. And I don't want to give too much away on the discussion. I think it's really good, but I just really want to encourage you to think about how sex, how gender roles influences the way we see other people. Another aspect of it is class and privilege, right? If people come from more privilege than others, how does that influence how we perceive other people and look at their behavior? Um, so this module is a discussion that I believe is really going to highlight that. So some tendencies in perception, we have what's called the self-serving bias, which refers to our tendency to judge ourselves more favorably than others. And then we have what's called the halo effect, which is our tendency to form an overall positive impression on somebody else based on one good characteristic they have. So I give an example on the exam. I'm giving you and I'm giving you one of the questions right now. And basically, it's a lady who is married to a guy who is abusive. He's unfaithful. He is verbally abusive. He's just an all-around bad person. And our friends ask her, why do you stay with this guy? And she says, well, he has a really strong work ethic. He's a hard worker, right? So I think we all know a relationship like that where a person has a host of bad qualities, but there's a person that stays in the relationship because of one good quality. Well, he buys me flowers every Christmas, or well, she's the mother of my children, and whatever it is, when we base our opinion off of just one good quality amongst a host of a different quality, that's what's called the halo effect. Our perception is based on only one factor. So another thing I want to touch on is the importance of perception checking. That's a method for verifying the accuracy of our interpretation. So one thing you want to do is you want to always provide a description of behavior you noticed, at least list 2 possible descriptions for the behavior, and then request clarification. And this helps verify, hey, what am I seeing? If you just go with your perception and never question it, then a lot of times it can lead to misunderstandings, right? And miscommunication, especially when you're dealing with people of a different culture, different background, different values. So it's really important to take a step back and to check our own perception. And that helps us to be able to see things through multiple lenses and be able to engage people in a more productive way. So in order to do that, one key component of this is what's called empathy. And empathy is the ability to recreate another person's perspective and experience the world from their point of view, seeing how they see things. And empathy involves perspective taking. There's an emotional dimension to it, and you have to actually care about other people. I want to talk about cognitive complexity. So cognitive complexity and empathy are related very closely to one another. Cognitive complexity is the ability to look at things from another viewpoint, not just your own. So when we talk about questioning our perception and perception checking, one important skill that's necessary in perception checking is what's called cognitive complexity. And that's the ability to look at things from a variety of different frameworks. Last week we talked about um, the Colin Kaepernick the Colin Kaepernick issue, and a lot of people have very strong opinions on what Colin Kaepernick is doing. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? The way I kind of see it is looking at things through different people's frameworks. If you're a person who fought in the military or a person who's very patriotic, I can see how that seems to be disrespectful. But also, you have a lot of people who served in the military who say, hey, you know what? That's why we fought. So you have a right to do it. And not only does he have a right to do it, but people have a right to look at what he's doing and say that it's disrespectful and that it's not right. That's what makes democracy such a hot mess, right? And part of it is the fact that we need to have cognitive complexity. We need to be able to understand things from people's viewpoint who support Colin Kaepernick and be respectful towards them. We also need the ability to understand and look at the world through the people who don't agree with him and think that what he's doing is wrong, and still be able to respect them as well. And I think that once we develop cognitive complexity, I think we're able to we'll have the tools necessary to interact interculturally with people of completely different views and value systems and still be able to have solid positive communication interactions. Last thing I want to discuss is the pillow method. The pillow method is located on page 104 and 106 of your book. You're going to see that on one of your exams. So I really want to encourage you to go ahead, crack open your book, take a look and read that, because I think that's going to be important to put in play in your own interpersonal communication. But also it's good to know it because it's going to be beneficial for you as well. We're at the end of the chapter. Hopefully you found this to be productive, and good luck in this module. If you have any questions for me, feel free to let me know. All right. Have a great day.